Today we're going to start by looking at just some argument basics, beginning with the question, what is an argument? Now, if you haven't already done so, I would recommend that you pause, go back and watch the argument clinic that I posted on YouTube. It's a classic Monty Python skit, and it helps you to identify a couple of different senses that the word argument is used. So try to do that first before you proceed with the video. Now, after watching the video, you'll see that the term argument is sometimes used in everyday language to just refer to a verbal fight. The kind of thing that often involves heatedness, emotion, anger, frustration. It's not a good thing when people say that they got into an argument. But in philosophy, in logic in particular, we tend to use the word argument to refer to a unit of reasoning. It doesn't have to have any emotion in it. It doesn't have to be heated. It's just a bit of reasoning that we're trying to lay out to show that something is true, or to find out that it's true, to prove it, to establish it. So in philosophy and in logic, arguments are good things. They don't have negative connotations. They're our tools for trying to figure out what the truth is about some matter. But, of course, if people are not familiar with this more positive use of the word argument, mixing up the two different meanings can cause unnecessary tension or frustration. I have been in conversations where I would say, let me lay out my argument, and somebody would get offensive and think, no, I don't want to get into an argument with you. But they just didn't understand that I meant the word to mean just give you my thoughts, lay out my reasons, and see what you think about it. And there's nothing negative about that. Okay? So in this class going forward, we'll mean just laying out a unit of reasoning. Don't think about it in that ordinary, everyday sense. Now let's start by laying out the anatomy of an argument. Arguments can be said to have three main components. An argument, first of all, has premises, any number of premises. And these are just statements or reasons, statements of your reasons or your evidence. It's going to have a conclusion. This is a thing that you're trying to prove or establish with those reasons. And then the inference of an argument is just the connection between the premises and the conclusion. The move from the premises to the conclusion we call the inference. And so when somebody gives you an argument, what they're doing is inferring the conclusion from the premises. So in doing so, you're making an inference. So we're going to use some silly examples here to give you a basic idea of what we're talking about. So I'm going to get some examples in the column to the right, and I'm going to mark them up so that you can see what the premises are and what the conclusions are. I tend to use C for conclusions and P's for premises. I find that to be nice, but it's just a matter of convention. And if we have multiple premises, then I tend to distinguish them with numbers. P1 for premise 1, P2 for premise 2, and so on. Just the way that I like to do it. So here are some silly examples, just to illustrate. The cat on the mat has a hat. So I'm going with the Dr. Seuss theme here. My cat Ari, short for Aristotle, no surprise there, philosopher, has no hats. Ari has no hats. Therefore, Ari is not the cat on the mat. Now, of course, the conclusion here is given away by the word therefore. That's what we call a conclusion indicator. And it tells you that what follows it is the conclusion. Ari is not the cat on the mat. That's the thing the argument wants to prove. So I'll label that C for conclusion. The premises are just what's left. So the cat on the mat has a hat is the first reason I'm giving for that conclusion, premise 1. And my cat, Ari, has no hats, that's premise 2. Okay? So I have a 2-premise argument. Now let's look at example 2. Socrates, no surprise again, my other cat's named after a philosopher, is having a great time since he's watching chipmunks from the window, his favorite activity. So again, we have a little word here, since, that tells you that I'm about to give you some reasons for what I'm saying. Reasons are premises. So it means what's coming after that word is going to be a premise. So premise, he is watching chipmunks from the window. Premise 1. And that's his favorite activity. I'm going to label that premise 2. Now, it's not obvious that you would separate that into a separate premise. It would be fine if you just had it as one long premise. But you can see that it's easy to chop that off. It could have just been a separate sentence on its own. When that happens, it's nice to just label it as a second premise, to break it into smaller chunks. And by process of elimination, what's left is the other sentence. Socrates is having a great time, so that must be the conclusion. Now notice something interesting here, that the conclusion is located in different places. In the first argument, the conclusion is at the end, and in the second argument, it's at the beginning. The location of the conclusion, it doesn't have to occur in any particular place. So the location is not an indicator of what's what. You have to think about what are the reasons and what are they trying to show in order to determine what's the premise and what's the conclusion. You can't rely on the location that it occurs in. Okay? So let's think a little bit more about identifying premises and conclusions. I already said that you should look for conclusion indicators, and you should look for premise indicators. Okay, we were going to make a list of some of those for you. But let me just say that it's a good idea to start by looking for the conclusion first. That's why I have that as step 1. Because you only have to look for one thing at a time if you're looking for a conclusion. Usually there's just one main conclusion. But if you started by looking for premises, you'd have to look for a lot of different things at once, because there's usually multiple premises. So I'd suggest looking at conclusions first. And here are some of the common conclusion indicators. Therefore, thus, so, hence. Anything that says conclusion. So in conclusion, proves or establishes or shows, then you're probably going to be giving getting a conclusion after that. Ergo, ERGO, is a fancy Latin term that you'll sometimes encounter, meaning therefore. And finally, I'll just mention infers that. Okay? We're going to come back to that one. Now, we can't make an exhaustive list. There's plenty of other possibilities, but this is a good working list, maybe some in your textbook as well. It's good to start by memorizing those if you don't already know them intuitively. Now let's look at premise indicators. So some examples there are fewer of those that we use commonly. Since, because, the word for can be a premise indicator. Anytime you see the word reason, somebody says they're giving you reasons or evidence, then they're probably giving you premises. If you see the word or the phrase infers from, then you're probably getting a premise. Now notice that there's a difference here. Infers that gives you a conclusion. Infers from gives you a premise. Just think about how you would say an argument. You would infer that a conclusion is true. You wouldn't infer from a conclusion is true. That's not good English. But you would infer that a conclusion is true from the premises. The conclusion comes from the premises. So if I say I am inferring something from premises, from something, then I'm probably getting a statement of the premises instead of the conclusion. So be careful with those two. Don't mix those up. Okay? So finally, after you identify your conclusions and your premises, then you can find what's left over by process of elimination. So if you find your conclusion, then all the other statements are probably premises, unless they're just extra information that's not part of the argument. If you find all the premises and then there's one statement left over, it's probably the conclusion. Okay, so use process of elimination. A few words of caution. Sometimes authors don't use indicators, conclusion indicators and premise indicators, because we're not all perfect writers. So you just have to be careful about that. Sometimes it can get hard, and you just have to think hard about what's really probably a reason and what's probably the conclusion when you don't have word indicators like that. Sometimes premises and conclusions are just not stated. They're implicit. Okay, we sometimes leave things out that are important. We assume the reader already knows it, for example. It might just not say it. So if it seems like there's a little gap in the reasoning, something's missing, you might have to think about whether something was left out that should have been stated. And then in doing that, you'll have to apply what's called the principle of charity. There's a temptation to make an author look bad if we don't like their argument by plugging in implicit premises for them that are awful, that are obviously wrong. But we want to think of our argumentation as a collaborative search for the truth. We're not trying to win anything or beat anyone. So let's be charitable to other authors, and when they give arguments and some ideas are missing, let's try to think about what we could fill in for them that would give them the best argument. Let's try to make it a plausible argument on their behalf as best we can. That's charity. That's the principle of charity. All right? So don't worry too much about those cautions right now. It's just worth being aware of them. We're going to start simple first. Now, I do want to say a few things about argument format. Often you'll see arguments in what's called paragraph form, or as I'm calling it, paragraph form. This is just how you normally see arguments, written out one sentence after the other, like we've seen so far. But the way that philosophers and logicians like to do it is what I call numbered premise conclusion form. That's a pretty common name for it. Some people call it standard form, or if they don't include the numbers, they might call it premise conclusion form or format. But here's what it looks like using the examples that I've given you already. So the first step is to arrange the premises vertically, one premise per line on top of the other. You see, so I have premise 1 on one line, premise 2 on the next line below it, and so on. Place the conclusion at the bottom. Separate all the premises from the conclusion using a line like that, a horizontal line, or the three-dotted triangle that you see there. Both of them are just two alternative ways for writing or separating the premises from the conclusion. Okay? And then give them labels. premise 1, premise 2, P1, P2, and C for conclusion, and so on. Or sometimes people just use numbers or just letters, or you can label them however you want. And sometimes you'll just see the labels dropped. But I like providing them. It's often helpful for reference to refer to parts of the argument. Okay? So argument reconstruction just means you take it out of that paragraph form and you put it into numbered premise conclusion form. That's called reconstructing the argument. And the reason that that's useful is partly because of readability. When an argument is in numbered premise conclusion form, well, then you don't have to go searching through this long paragraph to figure out what's what. What's the conclusion? Is it the first sentence, the last sentence, or somewhere in between? Okay, you don't have to worry about that if it's numbered premise conclusion form. You already know the conclusion is going to be at the bottom and the premises are above it. And it also provides clarity because, as I said, authors sometimes leave out premise and conclusion indicators. Sometimes authors leave out a statement that's important for the argument, a premise. But once you get it into numbered premise conclusion form, it's perfectly clear, okay, by that point. And everyone can look at the same argument and be on the same page on what they're discussing. And then finally, for ease of reference, so the labels P1, P2, C, and so on, make it really easy to refer to various parts of the argument that we want to focus on in a discussion. So that's often very useful, all of the different aspects of the form. I'll finally mention that philosophers, logicians, they even use this form, numbered premise conclusion form, in their published works, their published writings, articles and books. I do it myself when I publish an article. I would encourage you to try that out in your written work for this class too. It's very useful to do that. And if you want an explanation and a demonstration of how you would use numbered premise conclusion form in writing essays, short essays, longer essays, then I would suggest in taking a look at an essay on numbered premise conclusion form, or alternative title, How I Amused Myself with the Most Boring Essay Topic in History. So one day in a class, people were asking me, how do you add this to an essay? What would it look like? How would you use it throughout the essay once you state it in numbered premise conclusion form? And so I went home and I wrote an essay about it, just giving an example, a demonstration. And I got a little carried away with it, having a little bit too much fun, as you'll see if you read it. But that's useful also for those of you going into philosophy. You'll have to do this at some point, and so it's good to get used to that now. Okay? So we'll stop there. Hopefully you found that useful. And let me know if you have any questions about it. Be happy to hear from you, and I look forward to seeing you trying this out on your own.